Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. So I have with me here Abdullah Sattar, brother who did I start lagging?
There was a bit of a lag, but I think I can hear you.
Okay, inshallah we'll be all right. Inshallah we'll be all right.
Yeah.
So I have with me a brother who reached out on Facebook with a couple of questions. So brother, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit? Tell us what you're kind of interested, what you're about, and inshallah go ahead and ask any question.
For sure. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thanks, Ibrahim, for the time. My name is Abdullah. By profession, I'm an engineer. I'm a computer engineer, but I've been interested in Islamic philosophy, theology, and thought for the longest time, tasawwuf as well. And, the primary motivation for me to kind of look into these things were just answers from my own self. I mean, just to get that certainty. And I have an Instagram page at Abdullah Sattar, and I kind of post religious material on there. And I've done some Instagram lives on Islamic philosophy, arguments for the existence of God. And I just had a couple of questions on certain arguments. And mashallah, I saw your account, The Muslim Theist. I saw your podcast with Elmo. And I really wanted to discuss these with you.
Right. Bismillah. So why don't you go ahead and ask me a question and we'll see how we do.
For sure, Bismillah. So let's start with the contingency argument, right? Now, the argument from contingency says that, and let's go with Ibn Sina's version of it, that there is existence, and then it could be an existence. He doesn't define that in the first premise, but there is existence, and then he splits that existence into three categories, which is necessary, impossible, and contingent. And he says that, these existences demand explanation. So the explanation for the necessary is in and of itself. The explanation for the contingent is external to it. And then the explanation for the impossible is that it doesn't exist. So that doesn't posit an explanation. Mm-hmm. But without going into the actual argument, we can go into that as well if you want. But my question was a bit on the premise number 2, which is that how do we know that everything has an explanation? I mean, if you do think of the universe as a closed system, right? I guess my question is, how can we prove that it's not a closed system? And that if you were to maximize this to the level of the universe, how do we say that the universe still has an explanation, like the entire system of the universe?
Right. Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So the first thing that I would say is that there are many different versions of the contingency argument. That, as far as my understanding goes, is not Ibn Sina's version. That is more akin to Leibniz's version of the contingency argument, which relies on the principle of sufficient reason. Right. So when we're talking about Ibn Sina's argument, he doesn't say that everything has to have an explanation. Right. What he says is that everything has to have a cause, and then he defines cause in a particular way, which is going to help us avoid Hume's objection, which is why personally, when even talking about this argument, I prefer not even to use the word cause, because as soon as you say that, people have a particular idea of what a cause is, and then a bunch of other objections come from quantum mechanics and other things that people or from Hume. So what he means to say is this, right? That, look, if you have a thing, right, that's existing there in the world, it's either going to be dependent on something else for its existence at every moment of its existence, right? So it isn't like a temporal thing, what brought it into being. I'm saying right now, as it exists, either it keeps itself in existence, quote unquote, like it continues its own existence, or something, or it's depending on something for its existence. Yeah. As soon as that thing that is depending on for its existence, if that were to suddenly vanish, the thing itself would also vanish. Okay. So what's an example of that? A whole is dependent on its parts, right? So if I have a book, let's say, right? I have a book, I have a cover, I have 100 pages, I have whatever. Imagine all the parts of the book disappears. Well, then the book also disappears. You no longer have a book if you don't have the parts, right? Likewise, let's say you take something to be made of atoms, right? Okay, well, if the atoms no longer exist, that thing also will stop existing. That's kind of the idea, right? That's the idea that he's getting at, right? And so when he's saying this, when you look at anything that's there in the world, okay, you're going to have two options, right? Either it's going to be dependent on something else for its existence, or it's going to be dependent on itself for its own existence, i.e. it's going to be independent. It's not going to depend on something else for its existence. It's just going to be. Why can't it be impossible? Because if it was impossible, it wouldn't be actually existing, right? We're talking about things now outside of the mind that are actually out there in the world. So what he's saying is this: take any object. Okay, let's say the universe, right? The whole universe, it appears. Okay, here's a question. The universe right now, is it dependent or is it independent? If you say it's dependent, then logically speaking, by the definition we just gave for what a contingent being is, what a dependent being is, it's depending on something else in order for it to exist at every moment. Okay. Now, if you say, no, the universe itself is independent, okay, no problem. Then we've agreed now that there's an independent being. You're simply saying it's the universe, right? But now we can now have a further discussion about what the attributes or the properties of an independent being or a necessary being are. One of the properties of a necessary being, for example, just by definition, is that it does not have parts. Why? Because the whole depends on its parts. So when we look at the universe, does the universe have parts? Is it divisible conceptually, actually? The answer to that is going to be yes, right? The universe is divisible, clearly. So how can you say that the universe is an independent being while at the same time it's made up of parts? You see, so we have a problem. So in a similar manner, Ibn Sina is going to come and marshal a bunch of arguments and people after him to basically show that the properties of an independent being and to get us to something like an immaterial intellect, okay, which is going to be God. Okay. That's the strategy. Okay, so that's on that front. Now, to answer your more specific question, which is about the version of the contingency argument, which relies on the principle of sufficient reason. So this argument goes that everything that exists has to have a reason for its existence, a sufficient reason for its existence. There can't be anything just truly absurd. Okay. What is demanding that? Obviously rationality, but beyond that, beyond rationality, I used to think that this argument doesn't work, but Edward Feser in his book, 5 Proofs for the Existence of God, convinced me that it's actually a lot stronger than it would seem, because the obvious objection is, like you just mentioned, well, who says that everything has to have a sufficient reason? Why can't something just be absurd? Why can't something just pop out of nowhere? And here's the way that he kind of explained in the book, as far as I remember. What he says is this: look, when we're looking at explanations of things, right, or reasons for things, what's going to happen is, like, imagine a coat hanger and you hang it on another coat hanger, and then you hang that coat hanger on top of another coat hanger. So for example, you might say, okay, what's the reason for I don't know, for you know, just, okay, whatever, this microphone to exist, right? And you'd be like, okay, the reason it's existing is because it has a bunch of parts that are assembled in a particular way, and that explains why it exists. And you say, okay, well, why are those parts assembled in that way? Oh, well, you know, the atomic structure, blah, 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 the electromagnetic forces, and et cetera, that's the reason. And you say, okay, well, what's the reason that those things are the way they are? Why? Are they like that in and of themselves? Do they have are they necessary in and of themselves? Or is there a reason for it? And what's going to happen is this: either you're going to bottom out on something that's necessary in and of itself, which means that it would be impossible for it not to be that way. Meaning to imagine it being any other way would entail a logical contradiction. It's similar to, like, if I were to imagine a shape with 3 and 4 sides simultaneously. So like a triangle square. Well, you can't do that. Either it's going to be a triangle or it's going to be a square. There's no such thing as a square triangle, right? So imagining that is going to entail some kind of contradiction. When you're attempting to work out what that would mean, it would just entail a logical contradiction. So a necessary being is one that has to be the way it is, and if you try to imagine it any other way, it would entail a logical contradiction. It would be like a square triangle. So you're either going to get at that. The other option is going to be that you know, you're going to keep doing this contingency thing, or something without a sufficient reason ad infinitum. And the third option is going to be that, no, we're going to bottom out in something final, but that final thing is just not going to have any reason whatsoever for its existence. Okay. Now, the problem with that is this. Remember back when I said about the coat hangers, how you're hanging one coat hanger on top of another coat hanger, right? So imagine each coat hanger is a reason. So my reason for explaining, for example, the existence of the microphone in front of me is, you know, the parts that it's assembled of. The reason for the parts is because of the laws of whatever, or the atomic structure. And then the reason for the atomic structure is going to, so what I'm doing is I'm stacking these coat hangers. Now the problem is this: at the end, if the final coat hanger is not hanging on like a wooden thing, like the closet, the wooden thing you have in the closet, if it's not hanging on that, what happens is the whole thing drops, right? The whole thing drops, which means that every other explanation that you gave in that sequence also is absurd, which means ultimately when someone's asking the question, right, why is this microphone here? There literally is every answer, like any answer you give is literally absurd, meaning why? Because you're stacking your explanation for why this microphone exists on a series which leads to absurdity, which defeats the purpose of you giving an explanation to begin with. So the whole series of explanation ends up collapsing into absurdity. It basically bottoms out in absurdity. Another way to think about this is that when you're looking at the ocean, right, you only see the surface of the water, but you logically deduce there has to be an ocean floor in order for the water to float. If there's no ocean floor, what you're saying is that the water is just ultimately floating, right? Like the very bottom layer of the water is just like literally floating, which means the whole thing would collapse, right? It doesn't make any sense. So what that would mean is that literally, okay, if the principle of sufficient reason doesn't hold in one instance, or at least in the final instance, it doesn't hold at all throughout the entirety of the created order, which means that when we're sitting here and giving explanations, we're literally babbling nonsense, or it's some sort of human delusion, and ultimately everything has literally no explanation. And the problem with that is that as rational beings, we observe that things do in fact have reasons, and so we can't accept that these reasons are nothing more than like psychologizing, right? Like if someone told you the reason why this microphone exists is because a pink elephant suddenly materialized into the room and what do you call it, blew out this microphone from its trunk, you'd be like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, that's just complete nonsense, right?
Yeah.
But that explanation, if there is no principle of sufficient reason, is just as good as every other explanation, because ultimately it's bottoming out in absurdity.
Okay.
Right? The only difference would be when you're bottoming out in absurdity.
So that's actually an interesting argument. I read this on Feser's website. I have the book as well. I haven't finished it, but I was watching his debate with Graham Oppy.
Yes.
And now one of the objections that Graham Oppy brings up is like, Graham Oppy's point was that the bottom is a simple, but it's a physical simple. And the entire debate was, Feser's point was you can't have a physical simple. And Oppy's point was, no, you can have a physical simple, which could be the basis of everything else. Could you comment a little bit on that? Because, so Feser's point, sorry, just to add a bit on that, Feser's point there was, the reason you can't have a physical simple is because by definition, something physical has some sort of property. And then because it has a property, it'll be contingent on that property. Unless I'm like misunderstanding his argument, but that's what I understood. But what would you say about that?
Yeah, so this is now a different argument. This is the argument from motion, or from change, better stated in modern terms, the argument from change, right? So the reason why that's going to be a little bit different is because at least in regards to, I don't know, it might be a little bit different. I'd have to think about it to see if you could draw an analogous thing to say a physical simple is the ultimate explanation for everything. I suppose you could. I suppose that you could use that same objection even in the case of the contingency argument. But the reason why a physical simple doesn't work, right? And just to recap what the argument from change is, the reason the argument goes something like this: that change exists, right? It exists even if it's in your own subjective mind. There's still change occurring, meaning things, like for example, just the waving of my hand, that's a change, right? Now that the only way that change is possible is if there are potentialities and actualities, which means a potentiality is a way something could be, and an actuality is the way that it actually is. And the idea is that in order for change to occur, potentials have to be actualized. So if I have a rubber ball, that could potentially be a melted rubber ball, but unless I have something to give it heat such that it melts it, that's always just going to remain a potential. Like it could just be melted rubber, but you have to actualize that. Now, what that ends up getting you is basically a series of actualizers. So in order for any change to occur, you need something to actualize that change. And then the thing that actualizes the change is either itself potential or actual, and so it would require if it's potential, then it would require an actualizer to actualize it, and so you end up with something similar to the contingency argument, where you're going down a chain of causes, right? Now, what Oppy tries to say is that, look, you can just bottom out in a physical simple, no need for God here. The problem with that is this: when he says a physical simple, right, what exactly does he mean, right? Does he mean something that itself is not composed of parts, right, but is existing within a larger space, for lack of a better word, time, space, some kind of dimension, right? Because you're saying there's two, so there has to be more than one. How can there possibly be more than one if each of them doesn't have parts? They have to both be existing in this larger space, okay? Time, space, some sort of, 30-second dimension, not really important. The point is such that we can differentiate them. Now, once that's happening, okay, the problem is, that space is actualizing the physical simples. Meaning that in order for those physical simples to exist, they have to be in that greater space. Okay, and I'm using the word space very loosely. It could be whatever dimension.
I understand.
Yeah. You see the problem here?
Yeah.
So you don't avoid the problem because you're still having now a potential that needs to be actualized.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay. And then the other point that he raises up is that his point of view is that he doesn't say that theism is irrational, because he does accept that the arguments that are against God are not really strong as well. So if a theist believes in God, they're rationally justified in doing so. But his point of view is that because naturalism is simpler than supernaturalism, which is what he calls theism, therefore that's the one position we should ascribe to. Now, I want your opinion on this from, let's say, our philosophy, which is that this idea that just because something is simple, and let's not right now talk about whether it's a convincing argument, but just because something's simple, you should accept that. Do you think that in itself is a strong enough argument?
Well, look, I have an argument here. I have the simplest explanation for everything. This pen is a magic pen. Everything happens because this magic pen just kind of, you go like whoosh, and that's what makes the world works. Now that's a pretty simple explanation. The problem is it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Right. And it doesn't explain the phenomenon. Right. So the problem with naturalism is that it doesn't explain reality as we observe it. It has no explanation for the hard problem of consciousness. Right. It isn't even coherent because, again, you have things like the contingency argument, which are going to require us to bottom out at something. Now, if we're just going to bottom out on naturalism, what causes the mind? How did the mind even enter the picture on a totally naturalistic framework? Right. It requires you to believe things like that life can come from non-life, that basically, essentially, the higher can come from the lower, which is contentious. That information can be generated out of thin air. It's essentially like saying something can come from nothing, because information, the mind, life, these are not, these are things. These are not, just something that you can just hand wave away. And if your worldview doesn't give you a good explanation for those, I'm sorry, it's not a sufficient worldview. That's number one. Number two, naturalism is in fact not the simpler explanation, because naturalism entails multiplicity. Yeah, it entails multiple things, whereas theism entails ultimately bottoming out at one perfectly simple reality. Yeah. So the ultimate picture of things is in fact simpler on theism, I would argue.
Makes a lot of sense. Okay, I guess what his perspective was, his idea is a physical simple, so he kind of bottoms it out on one. But then there's problems with that physical simple too. I have a couple more questions, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So one of them, I'm gonna go back to Ibn Sina's argument, and then I'll come back actually to the tangent we took, which is a good tangent, which is the hard problem of consciousness and religious experience. But I'll start with Ibn Sina's argument. So I'm pretty sure this is where I read this, but I could be wrong. Peter Adamson, in his book on Islam and the philosophy in the Islamic world, he talks about the argument from contingency. And one objection that I don't think he brings it up, but he just brings it up in general, is that, Ibn Sina's argument does avoid the problem of PSR. However, the first thing you could say, well, the universe itself is a necessary existence, right? You could just posit that, and then you could say, okay, because the universe has parts and so, it can't be a necessary being. But the question is, the example he gives in the book is that of a set. So if you look at a set of mathematical numbers, a set of all even numbers, let's say,
Yeah.
the number, so within that set are numbers, but the set itself is not a number.
Yeah.
So could it be then that if you look at the universe, even though the universe itself might have parts, but could it still be necessary? If you compare or does that analogy not really make any sense?
Yeah. So what I would say is this: if you're going to call something the universe, but give it all the properties that you can derive from a necessary being, then what you're calling the universe is really God. Okay. So let me break that down for you. When we have a necessary being, we're saying that it's timeless, spaceless, one, perfectly simple, eternal, right? We're going to say that also that it must be an intellect, right? The reason is because that's how we're going to explain the existence of intellect within the universe. If you have a universe without intellect, then where did intellect come from? We don't have a causal explanation for it. Now, so you're going to require all of that. So if you're going to call that the universe, then we'll be like, okay, what you're calling the universe, we call God, or we call Allah. So that's the issue. The problem, though, what he's trying to do, though, what he's more trying to get at is that you could have basically the universe be exactly with the exact same properties as God minus intellect. Okay, that's the one attribute that they don't want to kind of admit to, because that's what really gives you God. If you don't have that, then what you're going to have is basically just like a very abstract kind of, but you're still going to have the same fundamental picture of the universe: dead, lifeless, no purpose, no meaning, no accountability, no day of judgment, no whatever. But as soon as you add intellect to God, now you're going to get justice, now you're going to get wisdom, now you're going to get all of the what do you call it? Instead of intellect, perhaps a better term to use would be consciousness, right? That God is ultimate consciousness.
Okay.
That's really where you're going to get the meat of the relationship between the slave and the master, etc.
Yeah. So if you were to like take this forward then, and if you were to like talk about the intellect, in my opinion, the strongest argument for God's intellect is the fact that we have intellect.
Yeah.
And how could a mindless machinery give rise to sentient beings such as ourselves? So let's unpack.
It's actually a little bit beyond that, right? Which is this: how could, like, here's the thing: we kind of take it as a given that intellect, quote unquote, could exist, right? That this could be a thing. But if you want to just take like a dead machine world, okay, and you have at the bottom some kind of non-conscious necessary being that happens to create necessarily creates, like has some kind of internal compulsion, which itself also kind of doesn't really make sense because it's simple. So you're saying it's not made of parts, so how can it have internal compulsion if it's dead? That doesn't make any sense, right? So but whatever, they're imagining this kind of thing. Why is it even within the realm of possibility for this thing to create intellect? Do you get what I'm trying to say? What I mean by that is this, right? Is that, take, for example, the color red. Yeah. I mean, you could easily imagine the world without red never existing. There's no red in this world. And in fact, there are probably colors out there, right? I'm saying in our conscious experience. I'm not talking about wavelengths of light, which our eyes can't detect or whatever. I'm saying in our conscious experience, the way things look, you could imagine easily an extra color just being there, like in the same way we have red, green, blue, whatever, just another color that nobody's ever experienced before, and that just being part of your experience, right? You could imagine that, what one with or one without. Now, given that that's the case, right, you can imagine the universe in the similar way that we're imagining the extra color, not without intellect at all, right? As it not being even something that's possible to create for this thing. So how, like, what is it that made this like an even possible thing to be made, if that makes sense?
It does make a lot of sense. And then, I mean, I was reading David Bentley Hart's book, The Experience of God. Have you read that book?
I made it about like 80 pages in, but I haven't finished it.
You should like read The Power and Consciousness. It's really good. And the best thing I like about him is he writes for the lay people, the laity, as opposed to the philosophers. But he lists a bunch of problems with the hard problem of consciousness, and some naturalistic attempts at explanations like epiphenomenalism, functionalism. I was hoping you could maybe unpack this a little bit and talk about why, if I was to come to you as a naturalist, for example, and I would say, well, why couldn't it just be neurons firing in our brain that are creating consciousness? Why isn't that a possibility? How is that not possible? Or why is it not possible that over time we can explain consciousness using naturalistic news?
Yeah. So what I'd say to the first one is that actually that is possible. It is possible that the neuron activity creates consciousness. What's not possible is that the neural activity is consciousness, which is what the naturalism is claiming, which the naturalist is claiming. If you're going to tell me that there's like a little bubble that comes out of my head, like in the comic books, and that's where consciousness is, yeah, okay, fine. You can give me some causal story about how the neurons are firing. I don't have a problem with it. My problem is that they're identifying that bubble with the actual neural firing, and that's what's absurd. That is what is absurd.
Okay, and then yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, because the experience of red it can't be found in the brain.
Yeah, because it's not a physical phenomenon.
Exactly.
What about, do you think it's possible for science in any way, shape, or form to kind of uncover what is consciousness?
Yeah, so what would have to happen is they would have to redefine nature, right, or physics or whatever, in such a way that it would no longer be what we call, like today, physics or matter, like these foundational terms of science: energy, matter, nature, whatever, force, whatever these terms that they use are, right? We'd have to redefine those in such a radical way that what we're now calling matter and energy and physics or fundamental blah blah blah, that would no longer refer to the same object. Okay. And what it would have to refer to is either mind, or it would have to refer to some third thing which encompasses both mind and matter, what we now call mind and matter. So they could do it by simply redefining the terms, but then we're no longer talking about physicalism or naturalism or whatever. We're talking about basically theism.
Metaphysics.
We're talking about metaphysics. We're talking about theism, really.
Okay, so kind of taking that a bit forward, if you talk about religious experience, and this is actually, in my opinion, this is the strongest. And I mean, even if you talk about, let's say, somebody like Imam Ghazali, he said that there's levels of certainty. You start with the inductive proof, and then he said, well, what if I'm dreaming? And then the next thing was logic, and he said, well, how do I know my logic is true? And then he went down to the last stage where talking about like marifa, and which is when he said that God filled my heart with light. Now, obviously, there is levels and that's a whole different topic. But my grandma, she experienced the presence of God.
Hang on.
Because of that religious experience or that connection.
Hang on. So there was a bit of lag there. I missed like the last thing I heard properly was that Al-Ghazali said that his heart was filled with light.
Yeah, sorry, I'll repeat that. So what I was saying was, what I said was, there's levels to marifa. Yeah. But if you talk about the most fundamental level or the most common level, which is with people who are religious, they say that when we do dhikr or when we pray or just this experience of God. And Hart in his book talks about, beauty. He talks about love. He talks about these emotions as being a reflection of divine omnipotence. So would you say that there's any strong naturalistic answers to this? And if there are there any counter answers? Or is this something that's also beyond the realm of naturalism?
What I would say is that they would require to first solve the problem of the hard problem of consciousness in order to be able to try and negate people's experiences. You see, so the fact that they don't have an explanation for consciousness as a whole means that now when we talk about the specifics of consciousness, my experience of God, my experience of the color yellow, my experience of whatever, they don't really have much that can be offered there. What they can do is they can correlate those activities or those experiences rather with neural activity. Okay, right. They can correlate them, but as we know, correlation does not equal causation. And so to say that those things just are neural activity, they wouldn't be able to make that jump until they're able to show us how consciousness as a whole is neural activity.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, also something like dreams. I mean, I was reading about Ibn Arabi the other day,
Yeah.
and he talked about the blessing of dreams, because dreams kind of give you an insight into the imaginal world.
Yeah. Okay, so why don't you go ahead and pick up where you left off? You said you were reading Ibn Arabi.
Yeah, so Ibn Arabi, he talks about the imaginal world, or
Yeah.
the alim al-khayal, and he talks about how that is an insight into the divine oneness of God. And then he talks about the importance of dreams within that context. I mean, dreams actually make you realize the ontological poverty of the world that we live in, basically, which is that, it's a level of reality that's very fickle in its nature. Because when you're dreaming, oftentimes you're like, well, you believe that you're actually awake. You don't think you're dreaming. And then you wake up and you're like, oh God, that was just a dream. And that also kind of goes into the other question of, what if the world is an illusion or a matrix or whatever, right? There's all those different kind of layers to it. But I feel like the more skeptical you get, I feel like the closest you will get to the existence of God. Because even if you deny the temporal world, or if you deny logic, even, for example, there's certain things that you can't deny, but you're just so innately a priori to you that are impossible to deny. And then I think that leads naturally to God. That's in my opinion. But I think the point I was making was that consciousness itself is such an illusion. And it kind of like, when I watched some of these internet atheists kind of trying to like say that, oh, it's been explained, it's kind of really annoying. But yeah, that's the question I had primarily on that.
Right. Could you explain what you mean that consciousness is an illusion? Because I wasn't.
Oh, no.
Okay. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Sorry for the technical difficulties. Inshallah, we'll try and pick up as best we can where we left off.
Inshallah. Yeah, you had asked me about me saying consciousness is an illusion.
Yes.
I meant that it's a mystery, not an illusion.
Right.
Mystery in the sense that there is no physical explanation, in my opinion.
Yeah.
There can't be, because it's necessarily it's a different dimension of reality.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, this kind of plays into the question that if we kind of go down this skeptic route, what is to say that we can trust reason itself?
Right.
And actually, before I actually continue talking about that, do you have any takes on this concept?
So I agree with you about I just wanted to clarify, because I thought you had maybe misspoken when you were talking about consciousness being an illusion. But I agree with you there. When it comes to doubting reason itself, I think that personally, I'm not a fan of that approach, though I can understand how that can lead that can lead someone to kind of the path of mysticism, which I'm not opposed to. Okay. And my problem with it is this, that in the same way that leaving reason can lead you down the path of mysticism, it can also lead you down the path of like a deep Nietzschean type of atheism, a kind of absurd atheism where you don't even care about your absurdity. And you can no longer be reasoned with. So it can lead you down solipsism, the view that only I exist, really, or at least I can only know my own existence and nothing else. A kind of complete nihilism, a complete, just kind of skepticism about the entire world. And then you're kind of trapped in this dark hole. And usually the tool that you'd use to raise someone out of that, which is reason, is just no longer accessible. So that's my take. That's my worry with that kind of approach. The other thing is that, just from a strictly logical point of view, I feel like when you start to question reason itself, you're going to end up essentially contradicting yourself. It is going to lead to some sort of relativistic self-contradiction. Which is my issue with that.
I agree with you completely. I personally think it's impossible to do this. To doubt reason in a very realistic way, and the reason for that is because you can't exist. You literally can't exist if you doubt reason, because anything you say, you don't mean it. But then you do functions. You have to do certain functions to stay in existence. But then what you're saying is you're contradicting it. Also, you can only use reason to doubt reason. So then, how do you know that you can doubt reason in the first place? Right.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like it's a paradox, right? And at the same time, if one takes that approach, how can one prove that one's taking the right approach? That could be the wrong approach too. So it's kind of, it just blows open, like you said, a whole field, which is just impossible to keep up.
Yeah.
And you know, honestly, like people really, you know, oppose the Pascal's wager argument.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I don't understand why, because in my opinion, that's actually a very strong argument. Now, from an Islamic perspective, if you were to base your faith entirely on that, that's problematic. You know, you base your faith on, oh, there could be a God, I don't want to risk it.
Yeah.
Absolute nihilist. Can you hear me?
Yeah, so it keeps telling me my internet connection is unstable, so it's definitely my end. But you know, what can we do? As much as I would have loved to continue this conversation, inshallah, I'll try to answer that last point, and then we'll call it a wrap, and maybe try and do it again another time.
Yeah.
Because it's been a great conversation with you, but for some reason I don't know why my internet is active. I have to kind of figure that out and fix it, inshallah.
That's totally fine. No, I was just gonna make the last
go
point,
ahead,
and then you can kind of give your take on it. Yeah, I was just gonna say, if somebody is a committed nihilist and they say, well, there is no, literally, you can't know anything, well, then you might as well go with the proposition that's gonna give you eternal salvation as opposed to eternal damnation. And I mean, I'm not saying that you should base your faith on that, but I do think that it's actually a solid logical argument if you're gonna be that skeptical.
Right. What I would say is that, first of all, with regards to Pascal's wager, again, if a person bases their faith on that, but then they grow in their faith to have direct experience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then that for me is fine, because at the end of the day, because that was simply a stepping stone to them now justifying or basing their faith on an actual relationship and lived experience with Allah, which is a valid justification, both like logically as well as scripturally. Now, that's the first point. The second point is, I used to think that Pascal's wager was foolproof as well until I heard a strong counter argument to it. So now I have what's called modified Pascal's wager, a modified version of it. So the counter argument that I heard is this, that if you're just going to say that, okay, well, you have two propositions, you know, which one is the, you know, you do the cost benefit analysis, and so you're going to go with this one. Someone could say, okay, well, you know what, it's also possible, right? It's also possible that, God, like there exists any one of the number of gods of Olympus, and they're the ones who are going to judge you on the day of judgment. So how are you now going to decide that it's going to be Allah, or, you know, the one God versus any of the polytheistic gods? So what I said, what I've decided is that you have to do a modified Pascal's wager, whereby you at least first logically narrow down the possibilities to, like, naturalism, let's say, versus monotheism. If you can now logically narrow it down to those two choices and like show that the gods of Olympus, etc., are fictional, then you're okay to make Pascal's wager a better bet.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, actually. Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. Okay. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah.
Yeah.
Okay. So inshallah, we'll conclude there, not because we were done, unfortunately, but because I don't know when my computer is going to start lagging again. So my apologies to you. My apologies also to the listeners if that was agitating at all. Inshallah, I'll try and to fix it for next time.
Inshallah, man. Thank you so much for the time. It's a great conversation.
Yeah, it was really good.
I look forward to having more of these. Yeah.
Inshallah, brother.
Forward to having more in the future. Yeah.
Inshallah. Really appreciate
Thank you, brother.
Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.